In this subject microprocessor, KCS 403, we'll talk about microprocessor evolution in times. My name is Gaurav Parashar. The content that I will deliver in this video is introduction and the different types of microprocessors like 4-bit, 8-bit, 16, 32, and 64, and the types of microprocessors. Now coming to the introduction. So in 1957, company was founded. The name was Fairchild Semiconductors. And due to intensive research, they designed the first IC in 1959. Then in 1968, Robert Noyes, Gordon Moore, and Andrew Groove resigned from the Fairchild Semiconductors and they founded a new company and named it as Intel. And then Intel grew from a three-man startup in 1968 to the way we know it today. So we'll try to cover different types of microprocessors which are there in the phone. So first we talk about the 4-bit microprocessors. So Intel designed 4004. It was introduced in 1971. It was the first microprocessor by Intel. It was having a clock speed of 740 kilohertz, having 2,300 transistors, and it could execute around 60,000 instructions per second. It was really remarkable at that very point. Then in 1974, Intel again introduced one more microprocessor and named it as 4040. Again, it was also a 4-bit microprocessor. Then coming to 8-bit microprocessors. So in 72, Intel introduced 8008. It was first 8-bit microprocessor having a clock speed of 500 kilohertz and it could execute 50,000 instructions per second. Far better than the 4-bit variant. Then in 1974, it introduced 8080 microprocessors with the clock speed of 2 megahertz and having 6,000 transistors. And this microprocessor was actually 10 times faster than 8008 and it could execute 5 lakh instructions per second. Then in 1976, a new microprocessor was introduced, was 8085. The clock speed was 3 megahertz. Its data bus was 8-bit and the address bus was 16-bit. It had around 6,500 transistors and could execute 7 lakh instructions per second. It was able to access around 64 kilobytes of memory and it has its own instruction set with 246 instructions in it. Then they started with the journey of 16-bit microprocessors. So in 1978, they built its first 16-bit microprocessor with the clock speed of 4.77 megahertz, 8 megahertz, and 10 megahertz, depending on its version. Then its data bus was 16-bit and address bus was 20-bit. It had around 29,000 transistors. Then it could execute 2.5 million instructions per second. And it could access 1 MB of memory with 22,000 instructions. And it was able to do multiply and divide instructions. Then in 8088, it was developed in 1979. Again, it was a 16-bit microprocessor. It was far cheaper than its earlier version of 8086. And it was again 16-bit microprocessor with 8-bit external bus. Then in 1982, Intel again introduced two different microprocessors, 80186 and 80188. They were both 16-bit microprocessor with a clock speed of 6 megahertz. Then in 82, it introduced 80286. It's 16-bit microprocessor and clock speed of 8 megahertz. Then afterwards, they started working on the 32-bit microprocessor variants, and then they first created its 32-bit version, and it was named as 80386. And in 1986, it was the first microprocessor that was designed by Intel of 32-bit, having the data bus of 32-bit and address bus of 32-bit, where it could address around 4 gigabytes of memory. Then in 89, Intel again introduced 80486. Again, it was a 32-bit microprocessor with 1.2 million transistors, and its clock speed varied from 16 megahertz to 100 megahertz, depending upon the various versions. Then it introduced its new family of microprocessors, named it as Intel Pentium in 1993. Again, it was 32-bit microprocessors, and it was originally named as 80586 with 66 megahertz clock speed. Then in 95, introduced Pentium Pro. Again, it was again 32-bit microprocessor. Then in 1997, Intel Pentium 2 was introduced. Again, it was a 32-bit microprocessor. Then Intel again introduced in 1998 one more variant, and that was called as Pentium 2 Xenon. Then in 1999, Pentium 3. In 2000, introduced Pentium 4, and all were for 32-bit microprocessors. Then in 2006, Intel had started working on the cores. So in 2006, they actually started with uh, uh, giving Intel dual core machines and the microprocessor with 32-bit and 64-bit, and it had two cores. Now, when it comes to cores, the cores are basically having cache inbuilt. Now, coming to the 64-bit variants of the Intel microprocessor, so Intel introduced 64-bit Core 2 in 2006. Then Intel in 2008 developed called as i7 with 64-bit. Then Intel Core i5 in 2009, again it was a 64-bit microprocessor. i3 in 2010, again it was actually a 64-bit microprocessor. Now all these were the different microprocessors. Those were there in the package of Intel. Then coming to the different types of microprocessors. So there are basically 5 kinds of microprocessors. So one is CISC, that is complex instruction set microprocessors, and these are also known as CISM, and they categorize a microprocessor in which orders can be executed together along with low-level activities. It mainly performs the task of uploading and downloading and recalling the data into and from the memory card. Apart from that, it also does complex mathematical calculations within a single command. Then different type of the second type of a microprocessor is RISM, and the processor was also properly known as RISC. So these are the kind of chips that are basically required to carry out small things within a particular command, and they are far faster than the earlier variant of CISC or CISM. Then the third type of microprocessor is called as superscalar microprocessors. So this is a processor that copies the hardware on the microprocessor for performing numerous tasks at a time. So there are multiple copies of microprocessors, and they perform the tasks. They can also be used for arithmetic and as a multipliers also. So they can carry multiple commands at the same time. Then we have this application specific integrated circuit called as ASIC. They are used for specific purposes that comprises of automated emissions controls or personal digital assistance computers. This kind of a processor is made with proper specification, but apart from that, it can also be made using the off-the-gear. So the last is the digital signal microprocessors, are called as DSPs. They are used for encoding and decoding the videos, and they are majorly deployed in sonars and radars and TV set-top boxes. Thank you.